Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to Book Sandwiched In. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rebecca Harrison and I'm the manager of adult services here at Central Library. Very excited to be helping out this spring by introducing our wonderful lineup of speakers. Thank you to the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library for sponsoring today's program. If you'd like more information about how to become a friend of the library, you can visit tulsalibrary.org/friends. Please remember, if you have any questions throughout today's program, please feel free to put those in the chat. And now I would like to welcome today's speaker, Mona Easterling. Mona began her post-secondary education at TCC, completing a biotechnology AS in 2010. Following graduation, she transferred to NSU's Broken Arrow campus to complete a natural sciences MS with molecular emphasis. Her thesis involved transgenic plants and was entitled Plant Selectable Marker Gene Deletion using BXB1 Site-Specific Recombination System. Her career passion lies in the interface of science and communication. It was a pleasure to begin working at TCC under the supervisory care of Dr. Diana Spencer as the OK Inbray, and I may be mispronouncing that, bioscience outreach representative in 2014. This grant-funded position allowed Mona to develop institutional knowledge and student support skills vital to her internal transition to AEP credits count program manager in 2016. It was with great joy that Mona joined the TCC faculty in 2018 to follow in the footsteps of individuals who began investing in her more than a decade ago. Please join me in extending Mona a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. My video, okay, here we go. I can see now. Thank you guys for being here. It's such a pleasure to be part of Book Sandwiched In. I would like to try to use the chat feature today as we move through this session. And just out of curiosity, I happen to be the last Book Sandwiched In presenter before the pandemic. So if there's anyone here in this session who was present then at our last in-person session, could you let me know on the chat? I'm just so curious to know if anyone was able to join us for that last live session. I was honored to be there at Central Library for that last session, and who would have guessed how much our lives would change from that last session at the library until today. So I'm really looking forward to having everyone here today and being able to interact electronically, even though we may not have that same sense of seeing one another in person. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Even though you won't be able to see me, you'll still be able to hear me, and I'll be able to see the chat. I want to make sure that if anyone has any questions, there will be distinct times in the presentation that I will stop and ask for feedback from the chat. So if you don't mind, if you have a question or there's something you would like for me to know in response to what I'm sharing, I would love to hear that as we move through this session today. Okay, so the novel that we are talking about today is American Princess, the novel that covers in a historical fiction with the first daughter, Alice Roosevelt. So this historical fiction is not something that I am particularly well versed in. So this was a learning experience for me, just even with the genre. And I did think that the author, Stephanie Marie Thornton, did a wonderful job of including the historical information for me as a reader that would give me some context for this character. And so today we won't be giving away big details, but we will be looking at the big picture of what this work was looking to accomplish. I noticed kind of as an exception that this book had two distinct covers, and the one I read looked like this cover featuring Alice Blue, the color of Alice Roosevelt, and just reading through the novel and being able to understand her impact on current events. This was one of the many things, Alice Blue, her color. So you could see this color was featured on both releases of the book cover, Alice Blue and her particular role. As a historical novel, I was interested to find out that there are readers who really congregate around this topic. And one of the most interesting reviews I read came from this Historical Novel Society. And the author, her particular line of work encompasses several, this is her site, and these are previews of the work she's done in the past. So many times she was reaching back into ancient history to bring historical fiction to life. And when she wrote this 2019 novel about Alice Roosevelt, it was a novel that was her first leap into these times. Since then, she's released one about Jackie Onassis, and then now she's working on something that's to be released, I believe, later this year about a historical figure who was a double agent. So she focuses on these female characters and now kind of a move in her career toward the modern American as opposed to these ancient figures. Lots of positive feedback online about this novel. Many people are commenting on the ease of the read and the nature of her communication regarding the family. She says that she was inspired by this children's book. So the author has a young daughter who came across this book, Mind Your Manners, Alice Roosevelt, and it is a graphic novel. And this graphic novel inspired her to look deeper into the life of Alice Roosevelt and ended up contributing to her final work. We can see here in these pictures that Alice is quite a character. She has a great deal of personality, and this is probably the first and strongest impression the author wants to make with us. But as we move through the work, we can see that Alice is more complex than that. When the author talks about her experience beginning to write, she references the Library of Congress papers, which were public and accessible to her. So the Library of Congress keeps over 3,000 items that belonged to Alice Roosevelt, her papers, and those can be visited in person. Okay, so very helpful to understand where the author was coming from. I haven't read anything by this author, but just a quick yes or no in the chat. Is there anyone with us who has read other works by Stephanie Marie Thornton? Any fans of historical fiction out there? Can you let me know in the chat? So I'm going to go ahead and reference the chat. Thanks to those of you who's giving a shout out to that old presentation. It was The Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. That's correct. And we talked about some of the work of the Roosevelt family and the impact that had on my life. And it's interesting, you know, it was a WPA program that influenced the Bookwoman of Troublesome Creek. And so we'll be taking a look at some of that today. Excellent. Yes, this author was new to me too. And I just wanted to interact with the audience to make sure if there was anything about her anyone wanted to share, they had the opportunity. So this book got me thinking about first daughters. And I wanted to show you, I found this interactive slideshow about first daughters over time. And I was kind of surprised because when I think of first daughters, I think of young women before age 18. And Alice certainly fit into that category. And so does Carolyn Kennedy in my mind. So she certainly was a young child in the White House. Some of the other names surprised me as they were, young adults, over 18, but still young adults. And some of these names and faces may register with you. They may live large in your conscious or unconscious memory, but isn't it interesting what kind of context we give to each of these young women as their fathers had the presidency? And hopefully we will add some names to the list in the future as mothers in that role of president. So we can look through these. And for me, in my own life, my grandmother was a very committed Democrat, and she encouraged me when I was a young girl to write a letter to Amy Carter. So I don't know if anyone else has ever had that experience of interacting with a first daughter in that way. And I hope that you would share in the chat so that at least if you have a story, we could interact about that story during the Q&A. So my grandmother had me write a letter to Amy Carter, and I'll follow up with that after we look through a few more of these pictures. Some of the people I had completely forgotten about because they were young adults at that time. So Chelsea Clinton definitely stood out in my mind when I was thinking about first daughters. But once again, some of these other young women did not. After I wrote to Amy Carter, I received, this is not the one I received, but it is identical. I found this image online. I received this postcard in the mail. And as a young girl, I was absolutely delighted. On the back of this postcard was another image, and I couldn't find my own, but this identical message I remembered exactly. So who knows how long I kept that or how often I looked at it, but it ended up being very important to me for many years when I was a young girl that Amy Carter had written to me from the White House. And this kind of interaction, it is very significant in the collective unconscious of America that we have not royalty. And, our fascination with royalty is evidenced in the popularity of series like The Crown. So we know that that's still there. But in addition to that, we have this layer where the public image of those in the White House can become very important to us culturally. And I was thinking, please feel free to share in the chat if that is the case. If you've ever written a letter to a first daughter. I also thought how interesting it was that in my mind, I don't have any strong correlation with a first son, not anything like a first daughter. Another thing I wanted to mention that I just happened to know, thanks to the fantastic work of Ken Burns and his documentary on the Roosevelts, that there had never been a family that required a large staff for correspondence before FDR. So, of course, Teddy and Alice were in the White House before that time. And what I remember is that there was one person who was responsible for family correspondence as an employee of the White House staff until FDR. And at that time, so much correspondence was received that the staff had to handle incoming mail had to be increased exponentially. So that's just a fun fact about a personal story that I remember about a first daughter. Now, when we think about Alice Roosevelt, we automatically think of her parents. Okay, so her life story is impacted by the life of her parents. And so let's go ahead and think, when I think of her father, I think about asthma. And I pulled up this infographic from the CDC. Asthma is a disease that causes wheezing and a constriction of the airways, and it can be controlled if it's treated. At Teddy Roosevelt's day, the treatments were not very advanced. And the disorder is actually very common. About 1 in 13 people have asthma. Asthma is something that you often hear about when you hear about Teddy Roosevelt. Alice's mother, as we learn in the early pages of the novel, was diagnosed with Bright disease. And that is a part of a cluster of diseases that is absolutely related to chronic kidney disease. So you probably know someone that has asthma, and you may know someone that has chronic kidney disease. The type of disease, Bright's disease, is now categorized as this medical word. I can try to pronounce it. If there is a physician here, I'm sure I won't get it right. But what Google has told me is glomerulonephritis. So this type of inflammation that ended up being fatal to Alice's mother during childbirth. Okay, so this is something she probably knew she had. There's a lot of related. So sometimes these conditions appear after some kind of infection, some kind of bacterial or viral infection, or sometimes they're part of an autoimmune cluster. So an autoimmune cluster would also include things like asthma. So we aren't sure what caused the Bright's disease that took the life of Alice's mother, but one thing all historians agree on is the significance this had to Teddy Roosevelt. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt's papers are actually accessible digitally. So an advantage we have over Alice, and I would encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about this to just explore this website. So I'm going to post this to the chat, the digital record. Alice's mother, and oh, great. I'm going to answer that right away. Alice's mother appears, her name was also Alice, appears in this image from the website I have of Theodore Roosevelt's journal. Okay, so her mother was Alice Hathaway Lee. And I don't know about any of our listeners, but for me personally, some of my most cherished possessions are the handwriting samples I have of some of my ancestors. And so this handwritten journal entry by Teddy Roosevelt was very meaningful to me. And since it's script, I will read this. I don't know how everyone's screen appears, but that way you'll have a chance to hear, even if you can't read, what Teddy Roosevelt wrote in his journal on Saturday, February 16th, 1884. Alice Hathaway Lee, born at Chestnut Hill, July 29, 1861. I saw her first on October 1878. I wooed her for over a year before I won her. And that's very precious language to me. We were betrothed on January 25th, 1880, and it was announced on February 16th. On October 27th of the same year, we were married. We spent 3 years of happiness, greater and more unalloyed than I have ever known, fall to the lot of others. On February 12th, 1884, And I'll move to the second page. Her baby was born, and on February 14th, she died in my arms. My mother had died in the same house on the same day, but a few hours previously. On February 16th, they were buried together in Greenwood. On February 17th, I christened the baby Alice Lee Roosevelt. For joy or for sorrow, my life has now been lived out. So we can see the frame of mind Teddy Roosevelt was in at that time. We know now a lot more about what these kind of events do in a physical body. And as a molecular biologist, this is definitely in my area of interest. So we're going to take a few minutes to kind of explore what are the big picture implications of an individual like Teddy Roosevelt, who was documented to suffer from asthma, an autoimmune disorder, going through such traumatic stress as he outlines in this entry. So the death of his mother and his beloved wife at the same time, and the birth of this tiny baby girl who then went to live with his sister for some time. Okay, I hope that seeing those pages meant something to those of you as it did to myself. As I mentioned, there's just something about seeing someone's words that really is meaningful to me. So one of the things we know about these disorders is that it's very complicated, okay? And this is a graphic I found from an NIH website that explains there are a cluster of inflammation disorders. And I'm sure there's some here that you recognize. And these inflammation disorders are impacted by genetic factors. And in that sense, that's why sometimes people say that they run in families. In addition to that, they are impacted by the environment. So this cluster of disorders that includes asthma is impacted directly by the genetic information that is inherited from your parents. And then it can be compounded or alleviated by the environment. Okay? So just to think about asthma alone, we won't think about asthma alone in an infographic right now. Asthma is a disorder that constricts the airways. Okay? The airways are constricted. I myself am an asthmatic. I am a lifelong asthmatic. And when I was young, the treatment for a severe asthma attack was to travel to a hospital in an emergency and receive a shot of adrenaline. And that adrenaline would enter the bloodstream and it would cause the airways to relax. Okay, that's part of our fight or flight response. So probably many of you have heard about how the fight or flight response can be dysregulated in conditions like anxiety. And you may have even heard about states of high arousal or low arousal. And that state of high arousal is evidenced in the medical treatment administering adrenaline to someone who's in an asthma attack. Okay? If you think about the life of Teddy Roosevelt, if you know very much about him, he actually generated adrenaline by very vigorous, robust outdoor activity. Okay? So it was like homegrown treatment for asthma is he participated in activities that would get his adrenaline up. And this in turn helped alleviate some of his symptoms of asthma. Okay, so we're going to look a little bit more into that and how and why that might have impacted Alice. Okay, I'm going to keep an eye on the chat, and I have a great graphic that I wanted to share about those airways. So the normal airway has a nice full appearance where a great deal of air allows to pass through the airway in volume. And if you've heard someone wheeze or gasp for breath, then you know this constriction has taken place. And any treatment for a long-term asthmatic is going to include some kind of interaction at the molecular level that allows for this to relax and open up and allow for greater airflow again. Although there are many causes, and this certainly wouldn't be effective for every asthmatic, it was effective for Teddy Roosevelt. The adrenaline from the activities that he participated in. So a person who is able to successfully do this as an asthmatic is often described as energetic. Okay, so they're often an early riser. In today's terms, they're the kind of person who's always going to get their cardio in. They're going to get their 10,000 steps. So this is a natural treatment and a way to address this physiological symptom. As one of a cluster of autoimmune diseases, you can imagine how much research goes into this, because what's happening at the molecular level is that this constriction is happening based on genetics and these environmental factors. Okay, and you may know that you may have even heard of the HPA axis. It's a complicated cascade of interactions that is responsible for it or interacts with many of these autoimmune diseases. And the claim to fame in the HPA axis is dopamine, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So adrenaline is now known as epinephrine, and this axis is highly specific to behaviors. So I bring you on this journey through the description of Teddy Roosevelt's asthma and his approach to handling asthma in his adult life. And people who have these symptoms often appear as very impulsive. And you can see that when you look closer at Alice's life. So in the beginning of the novel, when we hear things about her cursing like a sailor and smoking cigars and some of the very non-traditional things that she participates in, we can see from a molecular standpoint that these things have a relationship to what was happening in her life, her body, her genetics, and then also that environment piece. Okay, so that article that I just looked, that I put on the screen, I've placed the link to that article in the chat as well. So what is the implication of this complicated relationship between genetics and the environment today? So all of this is still happening. And when we think about Alice Roosevelt and what a tragic happening was in her life when she experienced this loss of her mother. You know, her mother was in childbirth. She didn't have the chance to know her. Some of you may have heard that our city, Tulsa, has a claim to fame when it comes to this topic. We know that having experiences like the death of a parent can qualify as an adverse childhood experience. And some of the biggest research, so I'm on the CDC's website, and some of the biggest research comes from the George Kaiser Foundation as well. So adverse childhood experience is described in many ways. And what we know now is that there is a relationship between the experiences that people have. So you may have a genetic makeup from your parents, the actual genes on your chromosomes that are found in your cells. But in addition to that, cells can be turned on and off. And these adverse childhood experiences are now being studied for the purpose of describing how they can impact genes being turned on and off. So wouldn't it be fascinating if we were able to see something like this about the Roosevelt family? Because they did face adversity. They did have many opportunities in their family over the years for these things to impact their family dynamics and their health. So, thinking about the Roosevelts, we can see through the course of the book, Alice moved through all of her own personal journey, including her interaction in Washington, including her marriage to a congressman, and eventually her relationship as a mistress to a senator. That resulted in a child. And through the course of Alice's life, she continued to behave, forging her own path, and lived to be 96 years old. So all of these things give us a little bit of insight into what motivated her and how she responded to adversity in her own life. So right now it is 12:42. I've posted some things to the chat, but I would love to answer any questions that anyone has. I didn't want to wade too far out into the science, but as a fan of the Roosevelt family, I was very intrigued by this connection of impulsivity and the possible explanation for some of that. And as an asthmatic, I can attest that the actual physical activity of accomplishing things in my day manages my symptoms. And I just feel that could actually be really helpful. The themes in this book are themes that we are still dealing with in American culture today. And I think when I look back and I see how impactful even the digital technology is, being able to access some of Teddy Roosevelt's digital artifacts, as opposed to traveling to the Library of Congress to see the papers of Alice Roosevelt, I just feel really encouraged. So that statistic of 1 in 13 is current, and we don't have a lot of evidence right now that that would move very much in a population. We just don't know enough right now. And since asthma isn't related to just one gene, that's not something we can track easily. Because you asked, I would like to bring up a tool that someone might want to use if you're really interested in tracking this kind of information. There is a wonderful resource called Places for Better Health, and it is also related to information like we see in the ACE score. And each year this is updated, but you can travel to these interactive maps, or you can just type in the name of your city and it will allow you to compare. They've actually recently changed from a city format to a county format, but it will allow you to see self-reported data that the CDC captures about all populations in the United States. So because asthma is one of their criteria, here you can see the actual prevalence right now, and it's very easy to add Tulsa County to your search. So if you are really interested in learning more about that. It's out there. And we don't have any big evidence that actual latent asthma is changing, but we do have some evidence that environmental factors around the world we can see changes. Great questions. Oh, I can see someone has posted to the chat about their own asthma and what they know. That's extremely helpful. Anytime we can learn more about how to control our own human health outcomes, I feel like not only do we benefit, but society at large can benefit as well.
I did want to note that someone in the chat commented that it's an excellent presentation of auxiliary information, not just a rerun of the book. And I definitely agree with that. You know, you took elements from the book and expounded on those in a very interesting way, because I think when I at least think about historical fiction, you know, science doesn't typically play a big role in that just because it's set in the past. So I think it's interesting looking at it through that lens.
Thank you. That's certainly just my bias. I can't look at anything without thinking about biology. And I was particularly interested in how I happen to know more about other Roosevelts other than Teddy and Alice, but I was interested to think about the implications of this in a family system. So thank you very much. I would also say that the author mentioned she was a big fan of visiting the actual site. So she did visit Teddy Roosevelt's historical site in New York City. That contributed to her insight into the novel. And I can see another question in the chat, but I will hand that to you, Rebecca.
So Tara asks, did the book spark interest in reading more historical fiction?
For me, it did. My reading list, my dream book list, it only grows. So as an avid reader, I'm sure everyone can relate to that.
Mm-hmm.
And I wouldn't say that historical fiction really bumped up in my list, but I would say I feel much more open-minded about it. I also would love to give a shout out to next week's book. I have personally read Hidden Valley Ranch, and I loved the book. So I am really looking forward to next week's book sandwiched in.
I am also looking forward to that, and I encourage everyone who is here today to come back next week, because as this talk has demonstrated, there's a lot to learn from Book Sandwiched In. Let's see. So I don't see any more questions or comments right now. Just personally, I wanted to thank you, Mona. I found this fascinating, and I also wanted to add that your speaking style is really engaging. I was able to be very engaged throughout, so I appreciated that. And Peggy in the chat, I think she says that the next week's book is The Woman Who Smashed Coats. The week after that is Hidden Valley Road. And Peggy is correct. I think we'll have the leaders of the Creative Truths Book Club here next week talking about The Woman Who Smashed Coats. And then somebody wants to know when you're coming back.
Good question. Good question. I love doing these, as evidenced by my willingness to pick up a book that wasn't at the top of my list. And I did have a lot of fun with it. I am such a huge fan of Tulsa City County Library System. I actually visited for my first time in person this last week after being vaccinated, and I can't tell you how good it felt to walk in a library. So thanks for all you do.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. And I'll echo what other folks are saying. We hope you come back and present again in the future. And somebody in the chat did ask, are these recorded in case we missed one? Yes, they are, and they're added to the library's YouTube channel. So any past ones, you can go back and view at your leisure. So thank you again, Mona, and I hope everyone has a lovely day, and we'll see you all next week.